Hi there. Today's review is of a really fascinating book, What Lies Beneath, by Peter Faulding, who for many years has specialised, in fact become the UK's leading specialist in forensic search and rescue, which is a very interesting field, but it's a very little known field. And his book really lifts the lid on this activity. So Peter Faulding started at the age of 5 by being taken into abandoned mines and caves by his father and some other friends who were very keen cavers, and he learned how to navigate all the different features underground and how to shore up mines to make them safe. And he grew up with this knowledge, and he became very interested in caving, also climbing, and also diving. So all through his formative years, they were his main activities. He also joined 10 Para, the parachute regiment, and went into parachuting, shooting, all that kind of thing. And he started using his expertise to help the emergency services. Initially the ambulance service, if they had to rescue someone in tight circumstances, restricted areas and so on. Also the fire brigade, the fire service, particularly in London. And over the years the fire service developed specialised rescue teams, but then due to budget and so on, they often let them wither and the expertise is lost. And then several years later they identify a need for it and start from scratch, so it's a big waste of money. And Peter Faulding started training them in the methods of this very specialised rescue field, but often he was leading the way himself. Then also the police. Certain elements of the police were sceptical, but then they found that he had expertise that wasn't within their ranks. Although the police do have police divers and so on, the very specialised rescue underground and high angle was lacking. This led to him being engaged to rescue and allow the work on the Newbury bypass, which was being obstructed by environmental protesters, the most famous of whom was Swampy. Those in the UK would remember it. And these guys and girls burrowed underground at the area where the road development was about to take place, because they were concerned about damage to the environment, cutting trees down and so on. And Peter Faulding was brought in to go down and to get them out. Now this couldn't be done by force, and this is really the most interesting, in fact jaw-dropping part of the book. I was reading it and I was absolutely amazed at what went on underground, because the news didn't really cover it. You know, you'd see people come to the surface and that was it, but what was happening underground was absolutely astounding. So these guys would construct very labyrinthine tunnels, trapdoors, multi-level, booby-trapped areas right deep underground. They would then lock themselves on, and this was accomplished in many cases by immersing their arms in buckets or oil drums filled with concrete, so they couldn't be released. And there was one girl he found, and she was actually in a crucifix position, both arms secured. She was covered in lice and fleas, and was dehydrated. There was no way she could take on liquid. She couldn't get a feeding tube into her own mouth because her arms were secured. And this was the kind of problem. On another job, there was a trap door with a sign on "Do not lift." So he dug a parallel shaft and found out that the trap door had a wire running down to another woman, it was, to her neck, and her hands were secured so that any movement she would have fallen and strangled. One of the guys that he encountered on numerous of these jobs was a chap called Dave. And what Peter Faulding used to do was he would take flasks down, he would give them drinks, he would drop an airline down so that there was fresh air circulating, and he'd give them water, and he'd talk to them, and he'd convince them. There's no way you could use force to extract them. And he was always worried that they would, while he was trying to unfasten the lock on, that they would handcuff him and lock him on down there, and that would have been it. So he did it all by persuasion, and mostly they realized they'd made the point. And this guy Dave, who was a frequent flyer down there, he persuaded him to come to the surface. And when they got to the surface and they were in a van, there was a television monitor because they dropped the CCTV camera down. And as he was watching, the chamber they were in collapsed completely. And Dave actually went into shock and collapsed. So it showed how dangerous it was. And one of the things that I realized in reading it, that these traps and lock-ons were a one-way affair, because it's very easy to lock yourself in or put your arms in concrete, but who's going to rescue you? The people who'd done it were they themselves underground and locked on, and the only people who could effect a rescue basically was Peter Faulding and his team. And had they not been there, had that expertise not existed, and when these guys started doing it, the original process, they didn't know that Peter Faulding had this expertise, they would have just died. The police couldn't have got them out. The fire service couldn't have got them out. The security people who were guarding the site definitely couldn't have got them out. They would have just died underground. So the mentality of people who do that, I mean, I was having waves of nausea reading this, to be honest. The idea of going underground into those tunnels, mine shafts and so on, it frankly fills me with nausea. And similarly, he did a lot of rescues of people up in the trees. On some of the protests, they would lock on onto high buildings or trees. There's a case he talks about persuading someone to come down from one of the very, very tall cranes, this kind of thing. So with this expertise, he founded a company that just to provide these services, called Specialist Group International, and he recruited quite a lot of guys who had worked for the various emergency services, gave them specialized training, but also procured a lot of specialist vehicles, boats, and search equipment, specialist types of ground penetrating radar, side looking radar, all this kind of sophistication. A lot of it came from the United States. And he gradually became the go-to guy for this kind of thing. The book covers a lot of really sad and tragic material on body recovery, people whose cars have gone into the water, trapped, people diving who've had accidents underwater, quarries and so on. And he again specialised in the finding, the identification and the recovery of these tragic bodies, and also bodies that had been buried by murderers, disposed of by murderers. Some of the serial killer cases are mentioned in the book as well. And then finally, one that I'd mentioned, he as an advisor was called in to the case of Gavin Williams. Gavin Williams was a mathematician who worked for GCHQ and was seconded to SIS to work particularly against the Russian target with all the oligarchs and so on in London, and he lived in Pimlico, and he didn't turn up for work, and after about a week some guys from SIS went round and he was found in the bathtub inside a holdall, and the holdall had been zipped shut and locked. So a very puzzling situation. And Peter Faulding was of the conclusion that there was no way that this could be done without leaving trace evidence. The victim was naked, didn't have any gloves on, and yet there were no fingerprints or DNA on the outside of the bag, which is highly unlikely. And also a yoga expert was brought in and said there's no way he could have contorted himself voluntarily, unaided, to get into that bag. And yet there was no other fingerprints or DNA found in the premises. So was it a professional job? Was it the Russians again? Something like 15 or 16 people murdered in the UK, probably by the Russian state, and was he one of them? So another interesting part of the book. As I say, really fascinating, an area I'd never really read about or heard about much before, and it kept me engrossed. What Lies Beneath, totally interesting book.